there. This is Reverend Ellen.
And Pastor Ernest. Happy Sunday.
And we have an opportunity to share with you a little bit more about ourselves. I know the last 2 weeks, Ernest shared about his life and I shared about mine last Sunday. And so now we're going to share about an opportunity that we had in seminary, both of us.
In separate seminaries.
Separate
experiences.
Yeah. We only realized that we'd both done this when we were recording, and we were recording long distance. So we were on the phone one night, and I said, "How did you know I did archaeology?" Because Ernest was talking about Israel, and he said, I did archaeology. And we realized at that moment that both of us had that opportunity. And it meant so much to me in my development as a pastor.
I think it has so many great lessons in terms of ministry as well that we find ourselves into today.
Yeah. It's almost like an investigative reporter, because you're going back and you're uncovering occupation upon occupation upon
layer upon
layer upon layer of life. That's what archaeology is, really. It's just the uncovering of past occupations.
And that's like your Ellen's email address for many years had to do with archaeology.
That's right. It was the articulator until one church member got upset. He thought that I was boasting. He said, "Oh, you think you're the only one that can talk?" And I said, No. It's not about talking. It's about uncovering things and clarifying things.
Using those little dental tools. And
that's right.
Piecing to the little itty-bitty little bits.
To get the artifact really clean so you could take a photo.
Yeah.
That's kind of like what we're doing in transitional ministry, isn't it, Ernest?
Exactly.
Yeah. We are uncovering your past with you, and we're discerning what it tells us about who you are now, and perhaps what the Holy Spirit is telling us about who you're going to be.
Well, just to give you a real brief introduction, I had the opportunity to go to Amman, Jordan, and we stayed at the American Center of Oriental Research, which is in downtown Amman in Jordan, near the American or the Western Circle, I think the 7th Circle. And I had a great opportunity to be there for the entire summer. For 2 weeks, I got to go to Jerusalem and various parts of the Holy Land in Israel for 2 weeks, and then crossed over. And that was quite an experience just to get across the border area. My group was based out of a group from a university in Canada, and we found a tell, which is basically a man-made hill on a hillside. Ours was around 3 stories high that suffered serious, not just erosion over time, but also had been destroyed by fire. And where I worked was a gate, and so a gate's kind of like a door, and so you'd enter into the doorway, and on either side of the door you'd find 3 chambers, and so 3 on one side, 3 on the other, so it's called a 6-chambered gate. So if you go into like a Bible dictionary, you actually find a 6-chambered gate described. And so I learned that summer that I enjoy watching people do what Ellen does, but I much prefer to take big rocks and chuck them over to the side. And so a big part of what I did had more to do with revealing the external wall, which was really exciting because it had not been uncovered for thousands of years practically. And so it was kind of exciting for me to be so actively involved in helping to identify the outer perimeter. And then in my square, we also found a really interesting artifact. It was a limestone basin. Because of the area, there was so much herding of sheep and goats and other animals. There was lots of wool, and they would color the wool in these limestone basins. And I actually have a tool that I keep at home and in the office that I believe was what they used to grind or push the dye into the wool. So that was kind of just a summary of my experience there, but just fascinating time there.
I know. If you go to the Bible, the 31st chapter of Proverbs talks about a godly woman, and it talks about how her husband is able to sit at the gate. That's what we're talking about, these gates. These chambers were places where the elders met to make decisions about the city. And it's fascinating. There's a photo that we're going to show you of a gate so that you can get a sense of what that looked like. Ernest was in Jordan. I was in Israel. Pittsburgh Theological Seminary has probably over 100 years of experience with archaeology. And we actually have our own site in Israel. Tel Zeta, it's called. And it is about an hour southwest of Jerusalem, about 40 minutes from Ashkelon or the Mediterranean. So it's kind of between the two. And we are the only ones that have ever dug there. They think that it might be biblical Libnah. But I was able to go the first year that we had that. We were at that site. And my professor, Dr. Ron Tappy, is a graduate from Harvard University, and he has done an awful lot of archaeology. And so it's his site, and I'm sure that he'll spend the next 10, 15 years writing about what we found there, and we found some amazing things at that site. And so I was there in 1999, and in the summer of 2000, I was able to go for 2 summers, and that was just life-changing. So we wanted to share some things with you about archaeology so that you could understand it. Ernest is going to share first on stratification.
So the idea of stratification is that we find out when we go to a dig site, like where I was in my square, in on our site, we had a couple of squares, and they'd be laid out. So you'd have the little rods that indicate elevation. And then after so many inches, you realize that's a different activity. And so as you pull back the layers, you find out that you're not just pulling back dust, you get to something that's of interest. And then lo and behold, oh, wow, we have a level of stratification here at First and Calvary. And so part of what we're doing in this season of transition is looking at the DNA of a congregation. And so sometimes to get to the DNA, we have to go deeper than just the surface level. But, understanding a church's history is a key part of that.
Exactly. And so then you dig down a little deeper from the soil.
Layer upon layer. And wow, we have First Presbyterian Church, the location downtown at Jefferson and Olive. And so First and Calvary is obviously a church that merged from 2 congregations. And this church, I believe, came from the Cumberland Church. First Old Presbyterian was out of the Cumberland Church. So that's a whole other stream of Presbyterianism that is in contrast to another stream that we came to. But it's definitely part of the history and the DNA in the life of this church.
So the more you dig into the soil in archaeology, you don't know what you're going to find. But as you find things, it starts to tell you more about the site.
Exactly.
So Ernest is going to dig down a little bit further in this pile.
And so we have a picture of Calvary Presbyterian Church. Okay. And so this was the site of the church that was located until the merger. And then this building is no longer situated here in Springfield. But we have definitely 2 different streams of Presbyterianism that came to be part of one congregation.
So that gives you then some other questions to ask about how does this church see its identity? Does it see itself united, or does it see itself with separate identities? And we get that from the stratification, from digging deep.
And so we dig deeper and we find out some of these stories deal with concerns about loss about identity, loss of people, loss of programs. What's the 7 last words of the church? We've always done it that way. Mm-hmm. Or we've never done it that way before, whichever the case may be.
Right. And if you don't deal with the loss, then you can't move on to the vision now and today.
Right.
So that's the first part of the transitional program. And because of COVID, it's been hard to get to that. Right. But we're starting to deal with that now. What are the losses so that we can ask God to heal those and move forward for God's preferred plan for us?
So I almost feel like you should be doing this since you're the articulator, because we're pulling back very thin layers, whereas I just want to take the whole thing and go like that. But that really wouldn't help anything. We're close.
Well, I think that they understand that Tel, this place that we're digging in Israel and in Jordan, is just a hill that's been created by years and years and sometimes centuries of occupation. And it just takes uncovering to be able to really determine who the people are and how they lived, and to really know them. And the same is true for the church.
So that leads to the question, what is the DNA of one congregation versus two separate congregations. And this is the time of the season we should be asking those questions. Why do we do what we do the way we do it? And so that speaks of what is the DNA right here that we have today.
Mm-hmm. So we could go on and on with this, but I think we're going to go to the next kind of aspect or component to archaeology. And that is, once you have dug and once you've discovered things, then you have to put them in context, right? So there was a dig called Tel Beit Mirsum, and that was the first dig that they took pottery from that they'd uncovered, and they were able to read it and understand the different styles of pottery and everything bore witness to a different time. It helped them to understand occupation and the people. So
different civilizations.
They had different pottery, just like today. The glass from the 1700s doesn't look like our glass.
Right.
But if you were to dig them up, you could tell, okay, this is from the 1700s. That means people were here in the 1700s. So I have some, they call them sherds, the broken pieces of pottery. I have them here, and I'm just going to share a little bit about what they mean. And Brian's going to be putting these up on the screen. This first one I'm going to show you has a pattern in it that's been scraped into it. And this was never done by the people of Israel. And so when I dig up a piece and it has these lines, I know that during this occupation, either they were people that weren't Israelites, or the Israelites had gotten a pot from somewhere else. It leads me to understand that trade has happened. Same thing is true of this piece. This is glass, and it's from the Ottoman period, and it was a bracelet at one time. This piece here has no kind of glazing on it. The Israelites never glazed anything. They did something called burnishing. Ernest, can you get up and get my pot? And I'll show you what that looks like. But this piece is really burned. And it was probably found in a place where there was destruction. And if you look inside the clay, you see lots of white pieces. Those are called inclusions. And this piece is probably pre-Bronze Age.
Wow.
Chalcolithic is the age that this piece probably comes from, which means it's like 3,000 years old, this piece. So you start to see, this is a jar that was given to me by Nancy Lapp, and her husband was a very, very famous archaeologist.
Yes.
And we'll take a picture of this, but you'll see that there are lines where this was burnished. That's what they did to create that sense of glazing, but they didn't use glaze. Unfortunately, there's also a pen line right here, and that has nothing to do with when this was made in the Middle Bronze period. But the lip of this, and also these lines in the neck, they're all indicative of the Middle Bronze period. So the same thing is true then in transitional ministry.
Right.
There are things that you do in this church that we can pretty much say that was developed in the 1930s. There are other traditions in this church that we know are very recent. And as a church, you discern what you want to keep and what you can let go of.
Sometimes those things are like furniture. Sometimes they're decorations. Sometimes they're curriculum or books. Sometimes they're artwork.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just things that we don't necessarily hold, but maybe they're ideals.
Yeah. And as transitional ministers, we're never going to go in there and tell you have to get rid of that. We're going to work with your session, with your leadership. But we realize that there are certain things that it's hard to let go of. But as a congregation, discerning God's preferred plan, we want to be able to do that.
Speaking about that loss.
Yeah. And letting go. And that's trust. So the last thing we wanted to talk about is something called a step trench. And a step trench goes from the top of the tell. Remember, we said a tell is a hill that's been created by occupation upon occupation. And if you want to know how old your tell is, what you do is you start at the top and you dig down a little bit, and then you dig down a little bit more and a little bit more. You create what they call a step trench. It's kind of like cutting into a cake.
It's almost like this, what we were doing with our layers here in a way.
Almost, but you're cutting into it so that you see. You don't have to wait until you've dug the whole tell, because nobody has that much money to be able to afford that. But you can dig down into it and see exactly the occupation. And there's a photo here that we're going to show you of that. And I just want to tell you a real brief story. I know we're going a little long, but this is fascinating. I was digging on the step trench, and I came to this massive burn. In other words, I dug and dug and dug, and all I got was burnt things, charcoal-y kind of ground. And at the very bottom of this burn, I found a couple things. One thing I found was a plaster floor. And the plaster floor had a little lip right next to where a wall would have been. Well, when things burn, they take the old stones and they make the next house, right? And so they had taken the stones, but they'd left the indentations of these stones right next to this little lip, next to this plaster floor, and it's white plaster. And in that area, I found a tiny carved carnelian, the orange stone bead. And when I handed it to the square supervisor, he got very excited, because that bead is only found in Egypt. And that floor has only been found one other place in Israel, and that was at Megiddo, the hill of Megiddo. And those occupations, and the fact I told you about that wall that the stones had been taken, was exactly 3 Egyptian cubits wide. Do you know what I found? I found the Egyptian occupation of Israel during the time of the pharaohs. It's in the Bible that the Egyptians came up and they got as far as Megiddo, and that's all the farther they got. And I found that occupation. Evidence of that occupation, a military installation from that time in the Bible. And that was an incredible moment for me. And more things are being found that prove and show that the recounting of the Bible is true.
I love that story, because I think what that speaks to us right now in this time of transition is the exciting part of this journey for us. As we are walking with you, as we are going on this journey of discerning what is God's desired future for First and Calvary Presbyterian Church. And it's just that same level of excitement, because so often churches are under so many levels of stratification, so many generations of things that have heaped over. And for whatever reason, in a time between installed pastors, such as we have now, so many churches make the mistake of not looking deeper at what is here.
Yes.
And then just the wondrous discovery, not of what we are doing, but how God is leading us to discern what God desires, what is here, and what is it that God desires to do and accomplish through us and in us.
And there's 2 ways you can go, right? You can go and look at it and say, that's our past, and we're just going to stick there.
Right.
Or you can look at like the creation of First and Calvary, and you can say they had a vision, and that vision led them to do something totally new and totally different. And it led to a history of life and vibrancy and excitement. And the same thing is true for you all now.
Exactly.
That God is leading, and we're just here to help you discern how God's leading. And the best is yet to come.
Definitely.
God promises. But that means that we have to put down our ideas and go for the Lord. Thanks so much for letting us be with you.
Thank you. The Lord be with you.
Take care.